The Emirates A380 cruised at 39,000 feet, its first-class cabin bathed in the golden glow of sunset filtering through oval windows. In seat 16B, Artemis Vale's fingers danced across her laptop keyboard with the precision of a surgeon, each keystroke worth approximately $12,000 to her tech empire. The woman who had revolutionized quantum encryption before her 30th birthday barely glanced up as flight attendants glided past, their practiced smiles reserved for passengers who needed attention. She didn't. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was flying to Dubai to finalize a defense contract worth $800 million, software that would protect military communications worldwide, while wearing a $5,000 Hermes blazer and pretending she'd never held anything more dangerous than a Mont Blanc pen. The other passengers saw exactly what she wanted them to see. Another tech billionaire in her perfectly curated bubble, untouchable and uninterested in the world below. But then Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom, and everything changed. Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation systems. We're in contact with air traffic control and working to resolve the situation. For your safety, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Artemis's fingers paused mid-keystroke. Technical difficulties. Navigation systems. The words hung in the recycled air like a death sentence wrapped in corporate politeness. Around her, passengers shifted nervously, some reaching for their phones despite the altitude, others flagging down flight attendants with increasingly frantic gestures. The captain's voice returned, carrying an edge that made Artemis's blood run cold. I need to ask if there are any current or former military personnel on board. Please identify yourselves to the cabin crew immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. 350 passengers and no one moved. No one spoke. The wealthy businessman in 16A adjusted his Rolex nervously. The oil executive across the aisle buried his face in his Financial Times, as if the numbers could shield him from reality. These were people accustomed to buying their way out of problems, and now they faced something that couldn't be purchased, negotiated, or delegated. Artemis closed her laptop slowly, the soft click echoing like a gunshot in the hushed cabin. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window. Designer glasses, perfectly styled auburn hair, manicured nails that had never seen a day of honest work. But beneath the surface, muscle memory stirred. Her shoulders straightened imperceptibly, and for the first time in 5 years, Lieutenant Colonel Artemis Ghost Vale began to surface from the depths where she'd buried her. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her breathing deepened and steadied. Her eyes, which had been scanning quarterly reports moments before, now swept the cabin with tactical awareness, noting exits, assessing threats, calculating angles. The other passengers remained frozen in their expensive seats, waiting for someone else to solve their problem. But Artemis was already unbuckling her seatbelt. She stood with fluid grace, her 5'7" frame suddenly commanding in a way that had nothing to do with her net worth. The flight attendant nearest to her, Maria, according to her name tag, looked up with the expression of someone desperately hopping for good news. "Ma'am, you need to remain seated. Tell the captain that Lieutenant Colonel Vale is requesting permission to come to the cockpit." The words emerged with quiet authority that made Maria step back involuntarily. This wasn't the voice of a passenger making demands. This was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. I'm sorry, but... United States Air Force, 15 years active duty, 3 combat deployments. I've logged over 4,000 hours in military aircraft. Artemis's voice never rose above conversational level, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Whatever's happening up there, I can help. The businessman in 16A finally looked up from his phone, his face pale. "You're military." His tone carried the same disbelief he might have used if she'd claimed to be a professional astronaut or deep-sea welder. In his world, people like her, people with her kind of money and influence, simply didn't come from places like that. Around them, other passengers began to turn, their expressions ranging from skeptical to desperate. They saw the same thing they'd seen for the past 6 hours, a well-dressed woman who belonged in their world of private jets and offshore accounts. The idea that she might be their salvation seemed as foreign as the possibility that their pilot might need saving at all. But Maria had been a flight attendant for 12 years, and she'd learned to read people in ways that quarterly reports never taught. She saw something in Artemis's eyes that the passengers missed, a steadiness that came from facing real fear and emerging intact. Without another word, she reached for her intercom button. "Captain Rodriguez, we have a lieutenant colonel requesting permission to come forward." The response was immediate: "Send her up now." As Artemis moved toward the front of the cabin, whispers followed in her wake. The woman who had been invisible in her success was suddenly the center of attention, and not for the reasons she'd spent years cultivating. Her Laubautin heels clicked against the aircraft floor with military precision, each step carrying her further from the identity she'd constructed and closer to the one she'd tried to leave behind. The cockpit door stood before her like a threshold between worlds. On one side lay the comfortable fiction of her civilian life, the boardrooms and bank accounts, the carefully managed image of a tech mogul who'd never known violence or chaos. On the other side waited the truth she'd been running from for half a decade. That Lieutenant Colonel Artemis Ghost Vale had been one of the finest combat pilots in Air Force history before she'd walked away from it all. She raised her hand to knock, and in that moment, the past and present collided with the force of a head-on collision at cruising altitude. Captain Rodriguez opened the door before her knuckles could make contact. His face, etched with stress lines that seemed to have appeared in the last 30 minutes, showed a mixture of relief and desperation that she recognized from a dozen combat missions. Behind him, the cockpit hummed with electronic warnings and the controlled panic of a crew facing the impossible. "Thank God," he breathed, stepping aside to let her enter. "Ma'am, I need you to look at something." The cockpit of an A380 was a cathedral of modern aviation, screens and switches and instruments that could guide 300 souls through any conceivable scenario. But as Artemis's eyes swept across the displays, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The GPS showed their position as somewhere over the Indian Ocean. The backup navigation systems displayed coordinates that placed them above the Sahara Desert. The radio compass pointed in 3 different directions simultaneously, and the stars visible through the windscreen formed constellations that shouldn't have existed in this part of the sky. "How long have you been dealing with this?" Her voice was steady, professional, carrying none of the uncertainty that had begun to creep into the captain's tone. 23 minutes. Started with minor discrepancies, but it's getting worse. Every system is giving us different readings. It's like," he paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound insane. "It's like reality itself is coming apart up here." First Officer Peterson, a veteran pilot with silver threading through his dark hair, looked up from his instruments with eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. "Ma'am, with respect, we're beyond anything they taught us in training. We're not even sure we're still over the same planet." Artemis moved to the empty jump seat behind them, her mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had kept her alive through 15 years of military service. She'd seen impossible things before, not like this, but situations where the normal rules seemed to bend until they broke entirely. In combat, you learned that the universe had layers most people never glimpsed, and sometimes those layers bled through into each other. "Show me everything," she said quietly, "from the beginning." As the two pilots began their recitation of events, Artemis found herself studying not just their instruments but their faces, their body language, the subtle tells that separated trained professionals from people on the edge of panic. Rodriguez had the steady hands of someone who'd flown through storms and mechanical failures, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of encountering something beyond his experience. Peterson was newer to the left seat, probably promoted within the last year, and the confidence he'd built up was cracking under the weight of the inexplicable. The first anomaly occurred at 1847 hours Zulu, Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on the clipped precision of an accident report. Minor discrepancy in GPS coordinates, less than a nautical mile. We assumed satellite interference, maybe solar activity. But then the backup system started showing different readings. And then he gestured toward the windscreen, where the setting sun hung in a sky that should have been showing the first stars of evening. But the stars that were visible flickered and danced like candle flames in a wind that shouldn't have existed at their altitude. "The constellations are wrong," Peterson said quietly. "I've been flying international routes for 8 years. I know these skis. But what's out there?" He shook his head. "It's like someone rearranged the universe while we weren't looking." Artemis leaned forward, her trained eyes studying the horizon. In the distance, clouds formed patterns that defied meteorology, perfect geometric shapes that pulsed with their own internal light. Below them, what should have been ocean reflected a moon that was 3 days past full, despite the fact that last night had been a new moon. She'd seen similar phenomena exactly once before, during a classified mission over the Nevada desert that officially never happened. The memory came flooding back with crystalline clarity. The way reality had seemed to bend around certain coordinates, the electronic instruments going haywire, the sense that they were flying through spaces between the normal world and something else entirely. "Have you tried manual navigation?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Yes, ma'am. Dead reckoning, celestial navigation, even basic compass headings. Nothing matches. It's as if the basic laws of physics decided to take a vacation." Rodriguez's attempt at humor fell flat in the confined space of the cockpit. Artemis closed her eyes and reached back through 5 years of carefully constructed civilian identity to access memories she'd locked away. Lieutenant Colonel Ghost, Vale had earned her call sign not because she was hard to see, but because she had an uncanny ability to navigate through situations that seemed to exist in the spaces between reality. 3 times, she'd brought aircraft home from missions that shouldn't have been survivable, through skis that shouldn't have existed. "We're in a distortion field," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet their stares. "I've encountered this before. Not exactly like this, but similar. There are places where the normal rules don't apply, where space and time get flexible." "Ma'am, with all due respect," Peterson began carefully, "that sounds like science fiction. So do quantum computers and satellite navigation until you understand the physics behind them." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd stared into the impossible and lived to write the after-action report. "The question isn't whether this is real, we're living it. The question is how to navigate through it." She turned to study the instrument panel more carefully, her mind cataloging every anomalous reading and cross-referencing them against patterns she'd seen in classified briefings that officially didn't exist. The distortion had signatures, rhythms that could be read if you knew what to look for. And somewhere in the chaos of conflicting data, there had to be a way home. "I need to know everything that happened in the 30 minutes before the first anomaly," she said. "Every radio transmission, every course change, every system check. Something triggered this, and if we can identify the trigger, we might be able to reverse it." Rodriguez and Peterson exchanged glances, the kind of look that passed between crew members who'd worked together long enough to communicate without words. Finally, Rodriguez nodded and reached for his logbook. As they began reconstructing the timeline, Artemis felt the familiar weight of command settling around her shoulders. For 5 years, she'd been Artemis Vale, tech mogul and strategic consultant, someone who solved problems with algorithms and market analysis. But 39,000 feet above a world that had apparently decided to rewrite its own rules, she was becoming Ghost again, The pilot who could find her way home from anywhere, even when home seemed to have moved to a different universe entirely. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but with each passing minute, each impossible reading on the instruments, the woman who'd walked away from military service was remembering why she'd been irreplaceable. And somewhere in the depths of her mind, a plan was beginning to form, dangerous, probably insane, but grounded in hard-earned experience with the impossible. She just hoped 350 civilians were ready for the ride of their lives. The Emirates A380 continued its flight through impossible skies, carrying its cargo of souls toward a destination that existed somewhere between the world they'd left and the one they might never reach. In the cockpit, 3 pilots studied instruments that told them nothing useful about their location, but everything they needed to know about their situation. They were lost in more dimensions than most people knew existed, flying through space that bent around them like water around a stone. But for the first time since the anomalies began, they had someone aboard who'd navigated stranger waters and lived to tell about it. The only question now was whether Ghost's legendary skills would be enough to bring them home, or whether they'd become another unsolved mystery in aviation history. A ghost flight that disappeared between heartbeats, between one moment and the next, leaving nothing behind but questions no one was authorized to answer. Rodriguez finished his recitation of events, his voice steady despite the impossible circumstances. At 18:34 hours, we received a routine communication from Dubai Control updating our approach sequence. Standard traffic management, nothing unusual. At 18:41, we acknowledged a minor course correction to avoid whether that wasn't showing on our radar. At 18:47, the first GPS anomaly appeared. Artemis absorbed the information, her mind automatically sorting and filing details that might prove crucial. 13 minutes between the course correction and the first sign of trouble, long enough for whatever they'd encountered to build up to critical mass, but short enough to suggest a direct causal relationship. "The course correction," she said quietly. "How many degrees and in which direction?" 7 degrees northeast. Took us maybe 15 nautical miles off our filed flight path. Peterson consulted his notes, his finger tracing their route on a chart that now bore no resemblance to the reality outside their windows. "Nothing dramatic. We've made bigger adjustments for weather." But Artemis was studying the coordinates with the eye of someone who'd spent years analyzing classified flight patterns over areas that didn't exist on civilian maps. 15 nautical miles northeast of their original course would have taken them directly over coordinates that triggered a memory from a briefing she'd attended 8 years ago. A briefing about phenomena that officially didn't exist but killed pilots who encountered them unprepared. "There's a reason your course correction led us here," she said, her voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge. "This isn't random. Someone or something wanted us in this specific piece of sky." The statement hung in the recycled air like an accusation. Both pilots turned to stare at her, their faces reflecting the kind of professional skepticism that came from years of dealing with mechanical problems rather than metaphysical ones. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, "are you suggesting this was deliberate? Because I can tell you that Dubai Control is among the most professional." "I'm not questioning Dubai Control." Artemis's interruption was gentle but firm. "I'm suggesting that there are forces in play here that don't show up on civilian radar or in standard navigation charts. Forces that have been documented by certain military units but are classified at levels most people never hear about." She turned to face them directly, her expression serious enough to cut through their skepticism. "Gentlemen, I'm going to tell you something that officially never happened. 3 years ago, I was part of a joint task force investigating unexplained aircraft disappearances over certain coordinates worldwide. We found patterns, specific altitudes, specific geographic locations where reality appears to be thinner than normal." Peterson laughed nervously, the sound carrying more strain than humor. "Ma'am, That sounds like something out of the X-Files. The X-Files was fiction. This is operational reality for a very small number of people with very high security clearances. Her voice remained level, professional, but there was an undercurrent of absolute certainty that made both men pay closer attention. What we're experiencing isn't unique. There have been 17 documented cases of civilian aircraft encountering similar phenomena in the last decade. 17. Rodriguez's voice was carefully neutral, but his knuckles had whitened around the control yoke. 17 confirmed cases. How many more went unreported because the crews either didn't survive or couldn't find their way back to reality coherent enough to file accurate reports? We'll never know. Artemis paused, letting the implications sink in. Of those 17, 12 aircraft were recovered safely. 3 were found as wreckage with no survivors. 2 simply vanished from all tracking systems and were never seen again. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the subtle hum of instruments that continued to report impossible readings. Outside the windscreen, the geometrically perfect clouds had begun to rotate slowly, like massive gears in some cosmic mechanism. "What happened to the 12 that made it back?" Peterson asked quietly. "Different things. Some found their way out through trial and error. Others followed emergency protocols that don't exist in civilian manuals. A few got lucky and encountered military assets that could guide them home." She met their eyes steadily. "One was brought back by a pilot who'd encountered the phenomena before and knew what to do." "And that pilot was you," Rodriguez said. "It wasn't a question." Call sign Ghost. Nevada, 2019. Classified mission that officially never happened over coordinates that don't exist on any map you've ever seen. The admission felt strange after years of careful civilian identity, but the situation had moved beyond the luxury of maintaining cover. "We were testing experimental navigation equipment when we encountered a distortion field similar to this one. Took us 47 minutes to find our way back to normal space-time." She turned back to the instrument panel, her trained eyes picking out patterns in the chaos that civilian pilots wouldn't recognize. "The good news is that these fields are navigable if you understand their structure. The bad news is that the navigation principles are completely different from anything you learned in flight school." "Different how?" Rodriguez asked. "In normal flight, you navigate by reference to fixed points, GPS satellites, ground-based beacons, celestial objects. In a distortion field, those reference points are fluid. Space itself is bent, so traditional navigation becomes meaningless." Her fingers moved across the instruments with growing confidence as muscle memory reasserted itself. "You have to navigate by the distortion itself, using its patterns and rhythms as your guide." Peterson leaned forward, his skepticism giving way to desperate hope. "You can get us home. I can get us back to normal space-time, whether that's the same home we left." She shrugged with practiced calm. "That's above my pay grade, but I can promise you this: we're not going to join the statistics of aircraft that simply vanished." As if responding to her words, the instrument panel erupted in a cascade of new warnings. The artificial horizon spun wildly, showing them simultaneously climbing and descending at impossible angles. The altimeter flickered between 39,000 feet and sea level, while the vertical speed indicator suggested they were ascending at a rate that should have torn the aircraft apart. "Beginning distortion navigation sequence," Artemis said, her voice taking on the crisp professionalism of a combat pilot in contact with hostile forces. "I need you both to stop thinking like airline pilots and start thinking like test pilots. Nothing we do in the next hour is going to make sense by civilian standards, but it's going to keep us alive and get us home." She reached for the radio controls, her fingers finding frequencies that weren't listed in any civilian manual. "And gentlemen, what happens in this cockpit stays in this cockpit. There are people who would kill to keep this information classified, and I'd rather not test their commitment to secrecy." The transformation was complete now. Lieutenant Colonel Ghost Vale had returned from her 5-year retirement, and she was taking her bird home through skis that existed in the spaces between worlds. The only question remaining was whether the aircraft and its passengers could survive the journey through reality's back channels, where the normal rules of physics went to die, and only instinct and experience could guide them back to the world they'd left behind. In the cabin, 350 passengers continued their nervous wait, unaware that their survival now depended on a woman they dismissed as just another privileged tech mogul. But in the cockpit, two professional pilots were discovering that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, and that the person sitting in first class might be the only thing standing between them and a very permanent addition to aviation's unsolved mysteries. The radio crackled to life on a frequency that officially didn't exist, and Ghost began the delicate process of calling for help from sources that would never appear in any official report. Blackwater Control, this is Ghost requesting immediate assistance. I have a civilian heavy in distortion field Echo 77. Request guidance for emergency extraction protocol. The response came through layers of static and interference that sounded like reality itself was having technical difficulties. Ghost Blackwater Control, we show you as KIA 5 years ago. Please confirm identity. A smile ghosted across her lips, the first genuine expression of amusement she'd felt since the anomalies began. Blackwater Control Ghost, still among the living, just operating under deep cover. Authentication code Omega 77 Delta Charlie. Long pause, then, Ghost Blackwater Control, authentication confirmed. Be advised, your current location is flagged as a Class 7 distortion zone. Multiple aircraft have gone missing in that grid square. Blackwater Control Ghost, I'm familiar with the statistics. What's the current status of extraction assets in my area? Ghost, no military assets within effective range. You're on your own for primary navigation. We can provide guidance and reference points, but extraction will be pilot skill and luck. Rodriguez and Peterson exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing realization that they'd stumbled into a world where their years of commercial flying experience meant less than they'd ever imagined. They were passengers now, trusting their lives to a woman whose credentials apparently included conversations with air traffic controllers who didn't officially exist. Copy that, Blackwater Control. Request you establish tracking beacon on emergency frequency 777.5. I'll need a reference point for return navigation. Ghost beacon established. Be advised, distortion fields are showing increased activity across multiple sectors. Whatever's causing the current phenomenon is getting stronger. That was new information, and not the good kind. Artemis felt her tactical awareness sharpen as the implications sank in. Individual distortion fields were dangerous but manageable if you knew what you were doing. Multiple fields showing coordinated activity suggested something far more serious, either a natural phenomenon on a scale that made hurricanes look like gentle breezes, or an artificial manipulation of space-time by someone with technology that officially didn't exist. Blackwater Control, request information on nature of increased activity. Ghost, classified beyond your current clearance level. Suggest you focus on immediate extraction rather than broader tactical picture. The dismissal was polite but absolute, carrying the weight of security protocols that had kept certain truths hidden from public view for decades. But it told her everything she needed to know. Whatever was happening was big enough to have multiple levels of government very worried, and classified enough that even her former clearance level wasn't sufficient for full briefing. Roger, Blackwater Control, beginning extraction sequence now. Will maintain contact on this frequency. She turned back to Rodriguez and Peterson, both of whom were staring at her with expressions that mixed awe, fear, and the beginnings of professional respect. They were starting to understand that the woman who'd been typing on her laptop in first class was someone whose existence was so classified that official records listed her as dead. Gentlemen, we're going to do something that will violate every principle of commercial aviation you've ever learned, she said calmly. I need you to trust me completely, because one wrong move in the next 30 minutes will scatter our atoms across several dimensions. Rodriguez's voice was steady despite the circumstances. Ma'am, at this point, you're the only one who seems to know what's happening. We're with you. Good, first thing, disconnect the autopilot and prepare for manual flight. Where we're going, the computer isn't going to understand the physics. Her hands moved across the controls with growing confidence, muscle memory reasserting itself after years of dormancy. Second, I need complete silence on the intercom. Our passengers are scared enough without hearing what we're about to attempt. She paused, studying the instrument readings one more time. The distortion patterns were strengthening, reality bending further away from normal spacetime with each passing minute. Soon, the window for extraction would close, and they'd become another unsolved mystery in aviation's classified files. Third, she said quietly, if anyone asks what happened here, we experienced severe but conventional navigation equipment failures and made an emergency return to Dubai. No mention of distortion fields, no mention of impossible physics, no mention of my military background. As far as the official record shows, we had a normal mechanical emergency that was resolved through standard procedures. Understood, Peterson said. But ma'am, if we make it through this, I want you to know that we owe you our lives. If we make it through this, you owe me nothing except your silence. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived with secrets that could reshape public understanding of reality. Some truths are too dangerous for public consumption, and some heroes are better off remaining anonymous. She reached for the flight controls, her hands settling into position with the natural grace of someone returning to their true element. For 5 years, she'd been Artemis Vale, tech mogul and strategic consultant. But in the next 30 minutes, she would be Ghost again, the pilot who could navigate the spaces between worlds and bring her people home from places that didn't exist on any map. The Emirates A380 began its descent into madness, following a flight path that would take it through layers of reality most humans never suspected existed. In the cabin, passengers felt the subtle shift in aircraft attitude and assumed they were beginning their approach to Dubai. They had no way of knowing they were actually descending into a realm where the normal laws of physics went to die, guided by a woman whose official records listed her as killed in action during a mission that never happened. But in the cockpit, 3 pilots worked in harmony with the focused intensity of a surgical team, their hands and voices coordinating the most important flight of their careers. They were bringing 350 souls home from the edge of reality, navigating by instruments that read like fiction and following procedures that existed only in the classified memories of a pilot the world thought was dead. The radio crackled with updates from Blackwater Control, their disembodied voices providing the only connection to the world they were trying so desperately to reach. Outside the windscreen, impossible skis beckoned and threatened in equal measure, promising either salvation or obliteration to those brave enough to fly through the spaces between heartbeats. And in the pilot's seat, Ghost smiled with the calm confidence of someone who'd done this before and lived to tell about it, even if the telling would have to wait for circumstances that might never come. The extraction had begun. Blackwater Control Ghost, beginning descent through distortion layer alpha. Request you maintain continuous tracking beacon. Ghost, Blackwater Control. Beacon steady on your position. Be advised, we're showing massive electromagnetic interference building in your area. You may lose communications during critical phase. That was expected but not welcome news. The deepest part of any distortion field was always the hardest to navigate, where space and time became so fluid that cause and effect lost their normal relationship. In that zone, radar and radio became useless, instruments provided contradictory information, and navigation became purely instinctive. Roger, Blackwater Control. If we lose comms, assume we're attempting Standard Extraction Protocol 7. We'll re-establish contact upon reaching normal space-time. Copy that, Ghost. Good hunting. The formal sign-off carried more weight than usual, acknowledging that the next phase of their journey would take them beyond the reach of any ground-based assistance. From this point forward, success would depend entirely on her ability to read patterns in chaos and find pathways through spaces that existed between the cracks of normal reality. Artemis turned to her civilian colleagues, both of whom were gripping their controls with the white-knuckled intensity of men who'd suddenly discovered that their chosen profession involved far more risk than they'd ever imagined. From this point forward, ignore all instrument readings except what I tell you to watch, she said calmly. The distortion field is going to try to convince us that we're flying upside down, backwards, and inside out simultaneously. Trust only my voice and my guidance. Rodriguez nodded tightly. What should we expect? Visual distortions, spatial disorientation, the feeling that we're falling when we're actually climbing, or that we're accelerating when we're decelerating. The field affects human perception as much as it affects instruments. Her voice remained steady, professional, but carried an undertone that suggested she was speaking from direct experience. The key is to maintain focus on the task at hand and not let your mind get caught up in trying to make sense of what you're seeing. As if summoned by her words, the world outside the windscreen began to shift in ways that made Peterson's breath catch in his throat. The horizon line wavered like a mirage, then suddenly snapped into a vertical position that suggested they were flying directly into the ground. The artificial horizon on the instrument panel showed straight and level flight, while the backup attitude indicator insisted they were inverted and climbing at 90 degrees. Steady, Ghost said quietly, her voice cutting through the beginning panic in Peterson's breathing. What you're seeing isn't real. Trust the process. But even she had to admit that this distortion field was more intense than the one she'd encountered over Nevada. That had been a localized phenomenon, probably triggered by experimental military technology. This felt different, larger, more organic, as if reality itself was sick and the symptoms were spreading. Ghost, we're showing some unusual readings down in the cabin, Rodriguez said, his voice carefully controlled. Passengers are reporting that their windows are showing different views from each other. Some see ocean, others see desert. A few claim they're looking down at cities that don't exist. That was a new wrinkle, and not a good one. In her previous experience, distortion fields affected navigation and instrumentation, but left visual perception relatively intact. If the field was strong enough to create individualized hallucinations for different passengers, they were dealing with something far beyond the usual parameters. How are they handling it? Surprisingly well, actually. Most seem to think it's some kind of in-flight entertainment system malfunction. The flight attendants are doing a good job keeping everyone calm. Sometimes civilian assumptions were a blessing in disguise. If the passengers believed they were experiencing technical difficulties rather than a breakdown in the fundamental structure of space-time, they were less likely to panic and create additional complications. Blackwater Control, Ghost, she tried on the radio, but received only static in response. They'd entered the deep zone, where normal communications became impossible and navigation depended on skills that couldn't be taught in any civilian flight school. We're on our own now, she announced, her hands moving across controls with practiced precision. Beginning extraction sequence 77 Alpha. I need both of you to maintain control inputs exactly as I demonstrate. Any deviation could scatter us across multiple dimensions. What followed was unlike anything Rodriguez or Peterson had ever experienced in their combined 30 years of commercial aviation. Ghost guided them through maneuvers that seemed to defy basic physics, climbing turns that somehow resulted in descent, banking left to turn right, reducing power to increase speed. The instrument panel became a light show of conflicting information, while outside the windows, reality bent and twisted like a carnival funhouse designed by a physicist having a nervous breakdown. Altitude 7,000 feet and climbing, Ghost announced calmly, reading from instruments that simultaneously showed them at sea level and 45,000 feet. Maintaining heading 270 magnetic, relative to distortion field magnetic north. Ma'am, Peterson said carefully, our compass is pointing in 6 different directions. Ignore the compass. In distortion space, magnetic north is a relative concept. We're navigating by field lines now, following the natural flow of the distortion back toward normal space-time. Her voice remained steady, but both men could hear the intense concentration behind her calm exterior. She was flying by instincts developed through years of classified missions, reading patterns in chaos that existed beyond normal human perception. The aircraft shuddered suddenly, not from turbulence but from something far stranger, as if they'd passed through a membrane between different versions of reality. The lights in the cockpit dimmed and brightened rhythmically, keeping time with a heartbeat that belonged to no one aboard. Transition phase, Ghost explained, anticipating their questions. We're passing through the boundary layer between distortion space and normal space-time. The aircraft is experiencing temporal flux as different parts of our structure exist in different realities simultaneously. Is that dangerous? Rodriguez asked. Only if we stay here too long. The human body wasn't designed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Extended exposure can cause permanent neurological damage. Her matter-of-fact delivery of this information somehow made it more frightening than if she'd shouted a warning. But we're almost through. Another 30 seconds and we should pop back into normal space. Those 30 seconds stretched like hours. In the cabin, passengers began reporting that their fellow travelers were flickering in and out of existence, while their windows now showed views of landscapes that belonged to no planet in the solar system. The flight attendants, trained to handle everything from medical emergencies to unruly passengers, found themselves completely out of their depth as reality came apart around them. But in the cockpit, Ghost maintained her steady narration of their progress through impossible space, her voice serving as an anchor to sanity in a world that had temporarily lost its mind. Field strength decreasing, instrument readings beginning to stabilize, we're approaching the exit threshold. And then, with a sensation like stepping from a darkened room into bright sunlight, they were through. The instrument panel snapped back to coherent readings. The GPS showed their position as exactly where it should be, 50 nautical miles southwest of Dubai International Airport. The stars outside the windscreen had rearranged themselves back into familiar constellations, and the moon had returned to its proper phase. Dubai Control, Emirates 77 Heavy requesting approach clearance, Rodriguez said into his radio, his voice remarkably steady considering what they'd just experienced. Emirates 77 Heavy, Dubai Control, we show you on radar.